Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Art of News Comics Journalism exhibition. I'm Rachel Obert, and I'm joined here today by my co-host, Audra McNamee.
Hi, we're incredibly grateful to have our guest for today's interview, the comics journalist, Sarah Mirk. How are you today, Sarah?
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Heck yeah. Sort of to start it off, let's define our terms. What is your definition of comics journalism, and what drew you to doing comics journalism?
Yeah, I think that comics journalism can be any reported story in comics. So what is reported means like you interview somebody, you collect facts, and you try to do accurate real life storytelling in comics. So my definition includes memoir, people reporting on their own lives, talking to family, as well as writing about somebody else's life. And I've done both comics and journalism for basically my whole life. I always wanted to be a journalist. When I was a kid, I loved reading reading the newspaper and thought it was just the coolest job you could have. I like talking to strangers, and I love being curious about everything. And being a journalist is really good for both of those things. I get to basically find people I'm interested in or stories I'm interested in, and then figure out what's going on with them and talk to them a lot. So I started working as a journalist when I was in college at the school newspaper, and then I got an internship at a newspaper in Seattle called The Stranger, and when I was 19, and started working for papers from there. And then at the same time, I also always made comics. So I grew up reading a bunch of comics. Mad Magazine, Grew by Sergio Aragonés, lots of good comics, and would draw them all the time with my brother. And then in high school, I started drawing diary comics and zines, though I'd never heard of either of those terms before. I thought I invented the medium and was just drawing them myself. And so I basically did both as a parallel track. I was a very serious journalist, and then drawing comics on the side. And then through all my journalism work, tried to incorporate more comics, tried to do some comics pieces for everywhere that I worked, and eventually worked with Matt Bors, who runs the Nib, and we made a couple pieces together, and he invited me to join the Nib in January 2017. So been a professional comics journalist since 2017.
That's awesome. It's so interesting to hear somebody who's been in the field for so long, and it's just sort of part of your identity and your work. It's incredible. What would you say your collaborative process is like? For example, in Guantanamo Voices, you're working with a lot of different artists from different parts of the world. How was that like in terms of editing and collaboration? How do you manage a project that scale?
I would say that all comics is a collaboration, because even if you're one of those people who's drawing and writing your own comics and putting them out on your own, you're probably working with a publisher or an editor, or at very least you're collaborating with the people who are going to be buying your comics, really thinking about your audience. So comics is great for collaboration, because typically you have people doing each piece of the project. For Guantanamo Voices, I researched and wrote the stories in the book, which are based on interviews with people who have spent time at Guantanamo. So it's 10 different stories from 10 different people who have spent time there. So I interviewed those people, took the transcripts of those interviews and turned them into scripts for the comic, and then worked with a different artist for each chapter to illustrate those stories. So that was helpful because it made a different visual voice for each chapter, along with the different actual voice that was in the story. And then also collaborated, of course, with the editor on the book, whose name is Charlotte, and then the publisher, which is Abrams Comics. And I also saw the people who I interviewed as collaborators there. So I shared the draft of the scripts with them, as well as the draft of the pencils with them, so that they would feel really good about what was being published, or at least know what was being published and sign off on it. And the way collaboration worked with the artists on the book is that I wrote those scripts, and then I gave those scripts to the artists, and they went through thumbnails, pencils, inks, and colors until the final draft. And I really love to work with artists in a way that gives them a lot of agency, I hope, and makes them feel like the project is theirs as well. So I don't give a lot of feedback on the visuals. I like give them the script. I have a suggested image for each panel on each page. And I give like a giant Dropbox full of reference photos. And then they can make whatever artistic choices they want within there, like what perspective to show things from, when to like do a really detailed close-up versus a scene that's far away. If they want to cut panels or add panels and think that flow works better, that's good. And the feedback I gave was mostly around like, does the text work? You know, does it like literally fit in the panel? And then on visual accuracy. So, you know, oh, is that actually that the boat would look different, or that person wouldn't have been handcuffed at that time, or this uniform is actually slightly different, that kind of thing, which was also what was helpful about sending both the script and the pencils to the people who I interviewed, is they could do a lot of that visual fact checking because they were there, and they can be like, oh yeah, that's not the right uniform, or the house was a little bit different, or the fencing here would have been a little bit different, those kind of visual details. So I really hope that everyone I worked with on the book feels like it's their project too, and not just mine.
Just looking at the breadth of your work, you sort of have an enormous variety of ways that you tell a comics journalism piece. So when you're like beginning a piece, how do you decide if you'll draw it or if someone else will draw it, and like who that person will be, but also if it's going to be a zine or an online comic or like this published book, or even if you want it to be in the comics form at all?
You know, that's a great question, and I don't have a great answer because it's just what feels right. Usually, like when I'm thinking about a story, I like see it in my head as either a comic, or I start thinking about it as a text piece. And it's just like the way that I visualize it in my head. I'm like, oh, this feels like a zine to me, or this feels like a longer comic to me, or this feels like a story I want to write out. And so I don't know how to explain that, besides it's just the way that I see it and the way that I tell the story to myself. And then usually the stuff that I draw is mostly about my own life or my own experiences, or I'm a part of the story in some way. A lot of times, if I'm not, a lot of times I don't draw stuff when I feel like I don't have the skills to draw specifically that. So a lot of the more technical drawings, for example, in Guantanamo Voices, there's a lot of really complicated drawings of like, you know, different buildings, like helicopters. I can't draw a helicopter. So my style is more cartoony. It's very, I would say like fun, and not very like true to life necessarily. And so it didn't really feel like the right tone for that really dark story that needed to be really visually accurate. So I didn't want to draw it myself. And then also, I just really like working with artists. So oftentimes I'll just want to try and find someone to work with because it's so much more fun, I think, to like write a script and hand it over to somebody else and have them draw it than to have to draw myself. People don't know that like writing comics is a total scam because it takes you, you can write it way faster than you can draw it. So you can just write in like, oh yeah, there's like 20 people standing around a horse, and then some poor sucker has to draw that thing. So I really love writing comics and handing them off to somebody else to see what they do with it. And it really just kind of feels like, is this a story that like I want to make like mine? I'm telling it about my life. I'm going to draw it myself. Or is it something that feels right to collaborate with someone else on?
As a follow-up to that, how do you think that the just sort of physical format and presentation of comics journalism, I guess like zine versus an online comic versus a book, changes the message of the work?
Definitely with a book, people take it a lot more seriously. It feels like a really big deal. And it also is a bigger deal because it takes so much time and money. You know, I wanted to make Guantanamo Voices for about 10 years before I actually started on it. And it was a project where I knew I wouldn't be able to do it without a bunch of money, because you have to pay to tell the story right. You know, it needs to be relatively long. The book is like 216 pages, longer than a zine. It's, you know, all these different artists working on the different chapters, you have to pay all of them. And then just like printing and distributing a book costs a lot of money, and you need all those kind of connections. So like, if it's not something that I want to devote like the next 5 years of my life to, and all of my money and call in all of my favors, I wouldn't make it a book. That's my dog barking here. But I like to make zines when it's like quick and easy, when it's a story that I want to tell immediately. Maybe it's just like a small story I want to tell, whether it's kind of a joke or like a funny thing that happened or something that just feels more immediate that I want to get out there immediately. I'll make it a zine. And I love making zines because they're so quick, they're easy to make, they're cheap to reproduce. You know, it's like 10 cents to photocopy a zine. And so if I have a story I want to get out there immediately, I make it a zine. But it's not seen as like as weighty as a book, you know. I don't have colleges calling me to talk about what zines I made, you know. Having a book is like a big deal. And then online comics, honestly, people love to read them. If you want to actually reach people, I think online comics are the way to do it, because the number of people who will read a book versus like click on like an Instagram post, like it's nowhere the same. Like a book that sells well might be 20,000 copies would be good. And like an Instagram post that's read by 20,000 people is like middle of the road. So like, you know, you just reach a lot more people with online comics. So I always feel like, oh, if you like, you don't have to write a book. Like if you actually want people to like read your story, like now within the next year, just like make it and publish it yourself online or get a publication to put it out, because people will actually read it, you know. And of course, like a book feels like a bigger deal and gets taken more seriously and can be read for a long time. You know, like it'll sit on bookshelves in libraries and at schools for the next 20 years, 30 years, hopefully.
Yeah, that's a lot of really good points and really insightful for those who want to consider publishing. I've never considered that. So
yeah, I always like, people always come to me and they're like, how do I make a book? And I was like, do you want to make a book? Seems like usually it's not a good idea. Like if you want to get a story out there soon, like a book takes a long time, it takes a lot of money, it takes like knowing people and like calling in every favor you've got from everybody you know. So most of the stories I want to tell, I don't want to tell in a book format. And then you don't make any money either. So it's a great job. You can kind of do a lot more, I think, just with publishing either yourself or with publications online or like in a zine format. I think you can honestly reach more people and more quickly.
speaking of reaching people, you mentioned earlier that when you make a work, you keep in mind that you're collaborating with your audience the entire time and that you have, you know, it's to be read, the work you're making. So who do you see your audience as? Their specific age group, or how do you feel about that?
It totally depends on the comic that I'm working on. With Guantanamo Voices, I was really thinking of the audience as being Americans who have heard of Guantanamo but aren't super clear on like what it is exactly. I was specifically really thinking of somebody who's 19 or 20 years old, because the prison is 20 years old next year. And so I was thinking of somebody who the prison has been around for their whole life. They probably heard the word a few times, and maybe they think of it as like a normal part of American life. But you know, I'm 34 and I can remember a time before Guantanamo, and I want to make it clear that like this was a prison that was made by people within my lifetime, and it can be ended by people within my lifetime. And so that's who I was really thinking of for Guantanamo Voices, was somebody who's like 20 years old, doesn't know who Donald Rumsfeld is, doesn't know like what happened exactly in the year 2002, because they were like 1 or 2 years old. But like this is an important history, an important place for them to know about. With my other comics, mostly I think of the audience as being like, something I always keep in mind is like somebody that has no previous knowledge of this topic. So if I'm writing about, like, it doesn't even really matter what it is, but anything where I have to explain something, I just think like this has to be accessible to somebody who has no idea what I'm talking about. So make sure I'm not getting too erudite or using like obscure terms or assuming any kind of base knowledge there. For my zines, I just think of the audience as like my friends, basically. People constantly say that my work is really relatable, which I always find surprising, because I just write it like about my own life, and I always think it's like unique and weird, and then I publish it and people are like, the exact same thing happened to me, or I feel the same way. And I'm like, oh, I'm not special. But it's really nice that people can connect with what I make that way, because I'm really just publishing it like, to make my friends laugh and to make myself laugh.
How do you or do you perceive yourself as supporting or uplifting diversity in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I really think about as a journalist is you have to make sure, like, first of all, like, what stories do you take on to tell? And this is something that, like, when I was first starting out as a journalist, probably for like the first, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, I was kind of like, I would report on anything, anytime. It was more like, we got to get something in the paper. This is happening. I'm going to go write about it. And now I'm much more careful about like what stories I take on. And I'm like, is this a story that's good for me to tell? Or should somebody from like a different background or ethnicity or experience write about this? So for example, if it's a story about something that's going on in like the Black community here in Portland, like, why don't you hire a Black writer artist to write about that? Don't hire me, like, get somebody else who like has the experience and knowledge and background to report on that in a way that I feel like I would just not be able to do it justice, or would not do it, it would be a huge, huge challenge. And then, so that's one thing I think about now, is I'm much more like, I'd only take on the stories that I think are right for me to take on. And if somebody asks me to write a story where I feel like that's not a good fit for me, you should hire somebody else, I tell them to hire somebody else who's of that background, and like try and pass that along whenever I can. So that's at the very start. The other thing is I mostly like working as an editor, which is getting other people's stories published. So as an editor, you're like behind the scenes, and you take pitches and edit stories and then help get them published. So that's what I do at the Nib. And that's also what I did when I worked at Bitch magazine. And I love doing that. So I love like having people come to me with ideas, and I'm there to help them tell their story and get it published. And I hope as an editor, I always come across as like empathetic and supportive. And I love that role, because it is like supporting other people, and like especially like people whose voices are left out of media is who I'm interested in publishing. So try to focus on, people of color, trans and non-binary people, and then in the United States, people from other countries, because we're really missing like voices from the global South in American media. So those are the people I try and focus on editing and publishing at the places where I work. And then when I do have the power to like hire people for a job, I always really try to make sure that the first people that I call and look up for are women, queer people, and people of color. And there's people who like I feel like don't have a huge amount of like influence and power to get like a ton of work on their own. So maybe it's younger artists who are just starting out, or people who I know like are trying to get more work in this kind of field, comics artists who I know like want to do more work and haven't gotten those kind of gigs. I'll try and seek them out and hire them for a job if I can. And then paying fairly and equitably. So never asking anyone to do work for free. That's a huge deal, So that's why like with Guantanamo Voices, I just didn't do it for a long time because I didn't have the money. And once I finally got the money, I was like, okay, now I can pay people to do this. And then the other thing I would say is, as a journalist, you have to be really clear about where your sources are coming from. So who are you talking to? That's one thing that's always a big issue in journalism, is like whose voices are you quoting in the story? Whose perspectives are you valuing? So if I'm working on a piece like about anti-trans legislation, how many trans people did I talk to versus like cis politicians? You always want to make sure you have a diversity of voices that are included in the piece. So those are the main issues I think about in terms of like just trying to like make media more accurately represent the world is how I think of it, and boosting those voices that are traditionally left out of media and have to jump over a lot more hurdles than like cis white guys that send out a ton of pitches and get a lot of stories.
Yeah, I think that's really important work that you're doing and a really important mindset. And yeah, I just think that's really important and great. And I'm glad that that's something that's on your mind as an editor and as a writer and stuff. That's super cool of you. Um, Talking about sources and talking about who you reach out in journalism and making sure you have like the full picture and everything. How do you approach subjectivity and truth in your work, especially when you do encounter um I'm not sure, like stuff that's not talked about as much?
Yeah, the old school journalism mindset is that like you're an objective reporter and every story you tell is objective. And I just have never believed that. I think that's totally rooted in like white supremacy, it's rooted in patriarchy, it's rooted in like, oh, there is only one story to tell, and it's mine, a white guy's who's 55 years old. And so it's just never been my experience. And I always think what's much more important as a journalist is to be clear about who you are, try and understand your own biases, and be like clear about your own identity, you know? So are you approaching the story as a white person? Like know that that's something that's factoring into like the way that you're reporting it and the way that you see things as like worth including, or who you talk to. You know, are you approaching this as like a cisgender woman, which I am, like how does that factor into the way that you're reporting on it? Just really trying to think about those kind of like biases that I'm bringing to the story just because of my identity and my experiences and background. But in terms of like, if I'm interviewing somebody and trying to like square that with like, is this true? Like, is this factual? What I typically do if I'm working on a story is just try and interview as many people as possible and see where the patterns line up. So if I talk to 5 people who all have experience on the same issue, what do they bring up and what do they not bring up? A really fun example of this is I just did a big piece for NPR about dog adoption and got kind of obsessed with like pandemic puppies because I just got a pandemic puppy. And the big like trending story right now in that is that like people are returning dogs to shelters, and there's like a wave of people returning their dogs they adopted during the pandemic to shelters. But every single shelter I talked to said that that was not their experience. They were like, nope, that's not happening to us. If anything, we're like returning to like pre-pandemic rates of people surrendering pets, but there's not like a spike. It's like returning to pre-pandemic levels. So in that case, I would never like frame a story around everyone's returning dogs to shelters because the 5 people that I talked to said that wasn't happening. So maybe it's happening somewhere to some people I didn't talk to. What I did say in my story is everyone I talked to said it hasn't been a problem. And you know, although it's been reported elsewhere. So that's like an easy example of that. A much more difficult thing is for a story like with Guantanamo, where every single fact is contested and there's no transparency because the government won't tell us anything. So for example, I just wanted to make like a little infographic in the front of the book about some basic facts about Guantanamo. One thing I wanted to include was like how many kids have been in the prison. So how many people under 18 were imprisoned there. That number varies wildly. I forget what the official government number is, but like different groups have gathered different numbers. And let me see what I finally wound up including. I think I had to do a range. Yeah, the number of juveniles imprisoned at Gitmo was between 15 and 23. So we don't know that number. So what I'll try and do is either just use a source that I think is reliable and make sure I cite it. So I'll be like, here's what Amnesty International says, you know, and maybe I'll say it conflicts with what the government says, if that's true. Or I'll just do a range like that and make it clear that it's unknown and try and just be like straight up about that. When I'm telling somebody's experience, like in Guantanamo Voices, for example, it's all people's life stories. So I interviewed them, it's their voice coming through. I think the best thing to do is make it very clear, like this is this person's experience. You know, somebody else who was at the prison would have had a different experience and would have told a different story, but this is this person's experience. So they're telling their story. And hopefully by putting like 10 of them together in a book, you see like, okay, there's different experiences that happen here. There's not like one universal truth. You know, this person who was in the military experienced something different, felt a different way than this other person who was in the military. Same thing with people who were, you know, working as lawyers there, etc. And then as much as I can, I try and like find facts in their stories that I can back up and cite. So they're telling their life experience, and I'll see like, okay, well, what details around there, like, can I confirm? I don't know what happened 30 years ago in another country, but like maybe there's a news report that can back that up. Maybe I can find some details within there to cite. So trying to fill out those life stories with as many facts that are confirmable as possible, but then always just presenting it as like, this is this person telling their story. So that's what you're reading is like a person's perspective and experiences, not something that's like an objective, universal story.
And with Guantanamo Voices also, there was a lot of stuff happening that was very sensitive material. And I was wondering, just talking about the technical side of journalism, how do you personally conduct an interview to accommodate difficult stories like that?
Yeah, so if I don't have the most experience with like trauma informed interviewing, so I'm sure there's people who could speak better to this. But what I try and do is do a bunch of research beforehand about the person and what they experienced, so that I know going into it like just what they've experienced. You know, I don't want to like ask someone a question that is really upsetting to them and triggering to them because I like didn't do enough research about what they've said in the past. So I just see that as like a form of respect for the person I'm interviewing, is like to read as much about them as possible. Hang on one second. And the other thing I always do if I'm talking to somebody about a really sensitive topic, for example, torture, in the Guantanamo Voices book, a lot of people have experiences with torture. If they've written about it elsewhere and I can use that material, I don't ask them to repeat it for me for the interview. So in the book, for example, I talked to Mazem Beg, who was a prisoner at Guantanamo. He's written a whole memoir about his experiences, which goes in depth on the torture he experienced. And he's done like literally hundreds of other interviews where he talks about it. And he said I could use that material. He said I could quote from his memoir. He said I could quote from other interviews he's done. That's fine. So I know that I don't have to ask about those things in the interview because I can use that other material. And that's really helpful to know, is like, I always try and do that if possible, so that somebody doesn't have to like rehash the most terrible things that happened to them again for me if they've already talked about it elsewhere, and it's okay to use that. And then the other thing I always just try and be is just like really respectful of like that it's a person that I'm talking to, and like not push them to like mine a specific story out of them that I want to get. So I really try to approach it more as like, hey, like I'm here to ask you questions about your life, but like if you don't want to answer them, that's totally fine. At the top of an interview, if we're talking about something sensitive, I always try and tell the person, I'm gonna ask questions, like if you don't want to talk about it, that's totally fine. Like just let me know, because I don't want to be pushy, and I also want to like acknowledge that there's always a power imbalance when you're being interviewed by a journalist, because they are the person that's going to take your story and like publish it to the world and share it on the page. That's a really scary thing. That's a lot of trust to put into somebody. And so I want someone to feel like they don't have to tell me the things I'm asking about if they don't want to. It's okay to not tell me those things. I don't want them to feel like any kind of pressure or like power struggle going on there. And then I also always ask them, you know, if they have any questions for me, like both at the top of the interview and as we're going along, like if they have questions for me, I can answer them, so that they feel like it's not just like an interrogation. You know, it can be, they can ask me any questions about what I'm working on or the story. And sometimes we'll talk for like, you know, 15, 20 minutes, sometimes like half an hour before I start asking them questions. And that always feels good, especially with people who haven't been interviewed much before. Sometimes it's like the first time they've ever been interviewed. And it feels good to like just talk like normal humans for like a little while before you start the interview. So those are some of the things that I try and practice. Oh, and then, sorry, one more thing. I think that sharing their quotes with them before they're published, or sharing the script with them before it's published, is really helpful. Because I know some journalists don't do that, they don't see it as ethical. I try to always share the quotes I'm using or the script with somebody I've interviewed, to be like, how do you feel about these quotes that I chose? If you feel misrepresented, or if there's anything inaccurate, like, let me know now. Because I would 100% rather have them flag something before it's published than after the fact. And so that's what I try and do, is make sure that like the quotes that I chose, they feel okay about having out in public. Sometimes, I'll talk to somebody for 2 hours and I'll wind up using 2 sentences, and I want them to know that those are the 2 sentences I'm using before it's published, and they're disappointed.
Before I get to my next proper question, I sort of wanted to follow up on your response to truth and subjectivity, and ask if you see the form of comics journalism as sort of a better way to get across sort of a journalistic message, like in regards to truth and subjectivity, or like whatever kind of relationship you see between those.
What I really like about making comics journalism is that people know that it's made by a person. I think when people are reading an article, there's just not a lot of like media literacy out there around like, this is written by a human and probably edited by another human, and they're bringing all of their biases and background to it. It's seen as like, this is like objective fact, it's printed on the page. It's gotta be true. And I think that newspapers like hold up that false idea sometimes of like, no, this is objective. And so what I like about comics is that because they're, drawn by a hand, you can see like the hand of the artist in there. And it's very clear that like, this is made by a person. And as you're reading it, you're really thinking about who made it. Whenever I'm reading a comic, I'm always thinking about the person that drew it and the person that wrote it, because it feels so much more handmade. Reading an article, I feel like both I and other readers have like less of that connection to the person that wrote it, unless their voice comes through really, really strong, like it's a personal narrative essay. So I just think that that comics are really a good medium for journalism, because you immediately think about who's making it, and then that puts you in the mindset of thinking about, okay, well, what biases and experiences are they bringing to it? So I think you're much more quickly thinking about how like, who's writing this history, than you do with print journalism, at least. I think, yeah, that's how I feel about it. I honestly like the form of media I see is most akin to it is like podcasts, where you're hearing somebody's voice. A reporter is telling you a story, and the whole time you're thinking like, this is a person, a human who's telling me the story, and you're thinking about who they are and what sort of experiences they're bringing to it. Often in podcasting, and like with like traditional radio as well, more and more the reporter can put themselves into the story and say like, I went here and I was thinking this, or like, I got interested in writing the story because of my experiences. And I think that's really good to tell us like, who are you, why are you interested in this story, what sort of perspectives are you bringing to it, really comes through in podcasts. And I see that as like the clearest translation to writing comics, where you're often putting yourself in the story and letting readers know who you are, and then they can see your hand throughout the whole story.
Thank you. And then I guess now, what have you learned from your previous works of comics journalism, and do you see like your work developing and changing over time, and what has that process been like for you?
Yeah, I hope I'm getting better. Like, I hope that's changing. Please. Definitely my art has gotten a lot better. So like my own ability to draw has improved dramatically over the last 15 years. I can see stuff I was drawing like 15 years ago, and I was trying to tell similar stories to what I'm doing now, but it just looked a lot worse. And it was hard to do. And so now it's really cool to like be at a point where I feel like my art is at a level where I can actually tell the stories I want to tell. Definitely when I started out as a journalist, I was really focused on like proving myself. I felt like I had a lot to prove. You know, I was really young and being a woman, and I just felt like, oh, I really had to like work to show that I was like serious and capable and intelligent and hardworking. And so I was just like very serious. And I've really been able to like tell more, like kind of just like loosen up a bit over the last few years and tell more stories about myself, report on stuff that I care about that's not necessarily like serious journalism, and like make more like calls like, oh yeah, I think this is worth doing, I'm going to pursue this, rather than feeling like, oh, I need to like prove myself to somebody else. Does that make sense? So that's all good. And then I think, I don't know, what stayed the same is I'm just like I'm way more interested in like the project than I am in making any kind of money. So I like don't really care about the money involved. And just need the money to like make the project happen. But I'm not interested in like being a commercial success. So I like give away a lot of zines. I give away a lot of comics. I'll like, volunteer my time for any kind of good group. And with Guantanamo Voices, I'm like donating the royalties from the book to people that are working to like end incarceration and Islamophobia. And for me, like money is a means to an end, and you need it to like get work done and buy food. But I've never been money focused, which is like a big privilege, and means I only do the work I want to do.
Awesome. I think just to look forward, how do you see comics journalism evolving in the future from this point?
I'm excited that I feel like there's a lot more people doing comics journalism these days, both more artists, more writers, and more news outlets taking it seriously. I remember like probably 6 or 7 years ago, I looked at the Wikipedia page for comics journalists, and there was like 5 people listed. It was Joe Sacco, Sarah Glidden, Susie Cagle, and like 2 other people maybe. And now there's like dozens and dozens of comics journalists, and that feels really cool. And not just like people who are doing it full time, but like if you like to draw and you like to tell stories in comics, you feel empowered to do a nonfiction story and to do a little bit of reporting. And hopefully if you're a traditional journalist and you feel like, oh, comics is a medium I can work in. So I just hope that like it becomes another medium like radio or like print, that people feel like this can be really useful for telling stories. And then a lot more people feel able to do, think like when I started out making comics, people often said to me like, oh yeah, like I know comics are popular, but I'm like, I don't know where to start, or I don't know how to draw. So like, how would I ever make something like that? And I think people have like more tools now to make their own work and publish it. So I'm excited to like have more people be able to make comics, and hopefully places publish them.
Amazing. Well, that was a great, insightful conversation. Unfortunately, it seems we're at the end of our time. This is an interview for Art of News, a comics journalism exhibition. Thanks so much, Sarah Mirk, for taking the time to conduct this interview with us. It was super great. We're so excited to see your work at the exhibition this fall. It's going to be great. Do you have any last comments before we wrap up?
No, I have some questions for you guys, but other than that, we're good.